Hey everyone, and welcome as we continue our study through the New Testament, looking at the New Testament church. And today we're still in First Corinthians. We're going to be going into First Corinthians chapter 4 today, and this is 1 through 21, and this concerns Paul's relationship with the Corinthians, and we'll see why here in a little bit. But as always, I want to encourage you, if you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel, to go ahead and do that, because that way you can get these daily. Like we said, we go through this every single day. It's a daily Bible study where we try to dig deep into a section of Scripture every single day. And right now we're doing the New Testament in chronological order, trying to mesh it out and look at it as it happened, right? As everything happened. And so, like I said, we're in First Corinthians today, and we'll continue this study for as we go all the way through the rest of the chapter here. So, as always, appreciate those who take the time to watch, and if you find this useful, I ask that you share it. That way, we can help send the message and spread the message to other people. And so, what I'm going to do today, I'm not going to read this one because this is lengthy. Even though it is 21 verses, it's a lengthy 21 verses, and so I encourage you, take the time to read. If you need to, pause, read it, and then you can come back and we'll look at the notes and everything that goes on through this. But like I said, with the really really lengthy ones, I just don't like to read those to you. I don't like being read to, and I know other people don't as well. And so I encourage you to take the time to do that. But what we see here, starting in chapter 4, verse 1, especially, Paul emphasizes his faithfulness and the genuineness of his motives, right? As an apostle of Christ, but only God can judge the heart. And so he kind of goes into this section where he's like, look, I don't care what you think of me. I really don't care what I think of myself. What I care about is what God thinks of me. And so that's kind of how he lays that out to summarize what he's talking about. And so he says, look, I, like Paul and Apollos, that we shouldn't be viewed as leaders competing for a following. That's not what we're doing here. And no church should have that. I've seen that. I've been part of that, and it's no fun, right? And that's not what we're called to do. But we're called to be servants of Christ, right? Who have been put in charge of explaining God's mysteries and communicating what God has written in the Bible and those kind of things. That's what we're supposed to be. We're to be servants, right? But for some reason in the church, we've got this idea that we're to be these type of leaders where you've got to follow me, right? Or I've got to be the most important one in the church, and I don't understand where we've gotten that from, and it's unfortunately it's hurting the church, and we got to be careful with that. And so they were stewards, right? We're stewards entrusted with the administration of the master's business, right? Or the church, and that's all we are. And their whole life was devoted to the master's concern, not their own. And that's what we should be. If you're doing something to if you're in the church, if you're trying to be a leader in the church just to elevate yourself and make yourself look important, that's going to be, for me, it's going to be a scary day for you, I think. But for all of us, right? If that's any of our goal to be like this, and that's what the Corinthians were doing. And as we've talked through this, and we kind of talked about it today, and we had church today, is a lot of what Paul's writing about here in Corinthians is what that was going on here is going on in the church today, and it's hurting the church. It's not helping the church. And I think that was one of Paul's biggest concern was he saw the what could happen if the church in Corinth wasn't fixed, right? If they didn't rectify these situations, these splitting into these factions. We see that today across the board with all the splits in our denominations, and all the splits among all the different beliefs, and how one thinks they're better than the other. That's not what we're called to be, and that's not how we're called to be. We're going to look at this judging, right, that he talks about here. And so what we have is that some of the Corinthians, right, they perhaps followers of Apollos or Peter, well, it looks like they were probably speaking like ill of Paul, especially of his speaking ability. They were dragging it down his speaking ability, thinking that they were able to judge his spiritual effectiveness. And he calls him. He's like, "Look, don't judge. We're not called to judge people, right? Now, there's a certain amount of judgment that we're called to do, but in this sense of judging people and their motives, and truly, basically in the end, we're not to judge the final place of people. That's not our call, right? There's things that we're called to point out and correct, right? But in the end, we're not to judge people's final place. And Paul tells them, look, he's like, my deepest desire was that he be found faithful before God, right? He didn't care about human assessment. He didn't care about his own assessment, right? So he didn't care about what he thought of himself. He didn't care what others thought of himself. He said, that didn't matter. What I care about is what God thinks of me. And that's how we all should be. That's how we all should be looking at it. So it says that only the Lord can fully know a person's heart. As faithful as I think someone is, right? I don't know their heart. I don't know their truth. Now, I feel like I can see the intentions of their heart and who they are through a lot of their actions, but in the end, I really don't know. And God's the only one who truly knows the the deepest desires of someone's heart. And so, he's the only one who can fully judge. And so Paul took God's judgment of his ministries very seriously, and that's what he's like. He does. I don't care about human judgment. I don't care about my own judgment, right? Because my own judgment is going to be skewed. I care about what God thinks of me in the end. And so Paul emphasizes the importance of not going beyond what is written in Scripture here, especially around judging people. And he goes into 5 different quotations up to this point, and I've listed them in the notes, and so you can look at that's so far through chapter 1 through chapter 3. You can research those on the side, but he gives that, and then he goes into these sets of rhetorical questions, right? And he kind of expresses in a nutshell the central theology, this central theological truth to the Corinthians, and in their divisiveness. In their trying to one up each other, in their trying to be better than everyone, they have forgotten that all of their abilities, all of their opportunities, all of their blessings are from God, right? Everything that they can do, everything they're bragging about, everything they're trying to make themselves look better than other people with and beat other people down with, all of that comes from God. And so they shouldn't be boasting about that. Right? They should be giving credit to God for what they're doing and trying to lift others up. That's our goal. That's in a Christian community. We should never be trying to tear someone down. We should always be trying to lift other people, other Christians up, and we should be trying to lift non-Christians up. So we shouldn't be trying to do anything to make ourselves look like the center of attention. And so, he says, what do you have that you did not receive? Right? All of this stuff. Like you didn't get any of this on your own. You received all of it. And so I think if Christians were to ask themselves repeatedly of themselves, like ask this of themselves, like what did I, like what of me, like what of all the gifts that I have is something that I didn't receive. Like there's people like, oh, I worked hard, I pulled myself up by the bootstraps. Who gave you the ability to be able to work hard? All those kind of things that we said. And so I think if we did that, it would produce a deep humility and a deep thanksgiving of Christ, of who he is. And so then Paul goes on to ironically highlight the difference between himself and them, right? While they're going around boasting, he's like, yeah, you're boasting all this. I'm displayed like a prisoner of war, right? I'm being beat. I'm going hungry. And you're over here talking, oh, look how awesome we are. We have this and we have this, and they're not suffering for anything. And so, it's interesting that, their attitudes reflected basically the wisdom of the world, and his reflected the wisdom of God as we look at this. And in their pride, the Corinthians thought they had arrived. Like, well, we're the best, right? I've seen people who are like this. I've seen churches who are like this. I've seen entire denominations that are like this. It's like, oh, well, we have the answers. We're the only ones who are right. We have arrived. And unless you're a part of us, then, and it's like, that's not what we're called to be. That's not the type of Christians that we're called to be. We're called to be humble in this. And so, but in the sense that they thought they had arrived, but in the truth, they had a long way to go. They had a real long way to go. And so, Paul points out, if they had truly arrived, they would be sharing more of their suffering that Paul experienced. He's like, look, if you had truly arrived, you'd be suffering like I am. So you're over there, kind of in a comfort zone while I'm being beaten and going hungry, and yet you're talking about how much better you are than me and others and some of the other apostles. And so, in this contrast, right, the Corinthians, they were proud of everything they'd attained and the respect that they had from others. It's like, so they were, and Paul, like, while the apostles, they suffered the scorn and contempt of people. And so he's like, look, you're doing something wrong here. You need to understand that. And so Paul reminds the Corinthians how much he had endured for Christ's sake. And so he concludes that section of the division of the church with gentle words, right, in a fatherly like way, and warning. He's like he's trying to be gentle with them, but at the same time be stern. And as their spiritual father, as we would call that, because he helped birth that church, who he first brought them the good news. Paul affirms his genuine concern for them. Right? He's not writing these letters to them just to get onto them. right? Or to be like, oh, look, I'm better than you. That's not his point in this. His point is, I'm writing these letters to you because you guys are in the wrong. What you're doing is not Christ-like, and so it needs to be corrected. And I wanted you to correct it because I want what's best for you, and that's what he's letting them. So as his children in the faith, right? They should listen to what he has to say and imitate his example and his teachings. That's some of the things that he's talking about there. And so then he writes that say he's sending Timothy, right? And so Timothy is also Paul's child in the faith and one of his closest associates. And Paul was with him when he actually preached the good news, when he helped establish the church in Corinth. We're going to see that later on in 2 Corinthians that he was there. And so Paul sent him to faithfully communicate what it means to follow Christ, because like we talked about, right? We know that the Corinthian church was struggling, so they let Paul know, and so Paul wrote them a letter, right? We know there was a first letter to the church. We know it's an unknown letter. We don't know. We've never seen it. And so, but then Paul gets these reports back, one orally, and then the Corinthian church writes him letters like, "Hey, we're struggling with this stuff." Like Paul, and one like they have a lot of questions, and then the one report's like, "Man, they're doing all these things. You wouldn't believe what they're doing," and so Paul's now sending Timothy to help them out, to help guide them in the right direction where they need to go. And so, but here's one of the things, right? Because he's sending Timothy, it looks like some of them had concluded that Paul lacked the courage, right, to visit them himself. But in fact, it was Paul, right? He deeply was engrossed in the work in Ephesus, and so he couldn't get away. And he talks about that. Paul, God wouldn't let him go just yet. He does eventually go, and he would visit, right? He's going to visit them soon, and he was going to confront those who publicly opposed him, who were talking ill of him, right? And show them that they're nothing more than just big talkers, right? You guys are just going around boasting, going around bragging. You have nothing on me. He's, you kind of basically saying, you have nothing on me. And so you need to basically stop, get to work, and stop trying to be better than everyone and just serve. And that's kind of what he's saying. And so he's saying, look, my life and words will demonstrate the reality of God's power in the end, right? We'll see that. And like I said, Paul's not doing this to boast. He's not doing this to try to make himself look like he's number one or he's awesome. He's doing it to show that, hey, look, I'm an apostle, and I'm not putting myself up on a pedestal. You all need to stop putting yourselves up on a pedestal. You need to stop this infighting. You need to stop trying to tear other people down. You need to stop trying to make yourself look good and get to serving and mimicking Christ. And we're going to look at that as we continue to go through here. And so we're going to look now. We go into chapter 5, where Paul continues this discussion, and he's going to condemn spiritual pride. He's going to get into that and then condemn their pridefulness that they had, and some other sexual immorality and things that we see in the church as they continue on. But again, I hope y'all are learning from these. I know there's a lot in this one, and so that's why I didn't read the whole thing. I tried to shorten it from that aspect of just giving you the notes, the high points, and digging a little bit deeper into some of the things that we see here. But I hope you're learning from these. I do. Every time I go through them, I see something that I didn't see before, and so it's a wonderful experience. And as always, I appreciate everyone who takes the time to watch.